As promised, this is part 2 of the OPP Heads Up Edition Overpowered Poker. This is Navonod. So if you haven't watched the first part, definitely you're going to have to go back and do that. I did get some pretty good reaction to part 1. I think people overall did appreciate it. But we are just going to pick right up where we left off. And in the first part, we left off discussing different types of opponents, your archetypal villains, and we're just going to get right back into it from there. Starting with maniacal oppositions, maniacs, hyperlags, just loose aggressive players. He bluffs often. He bets maybe too big. Maybe he overmerges, like value owns himself. Then we've got folds too much, like the nit. He doesn't bluff or bluff catch often enough. And then we've got our compliant stationary player who calls too often, doesn't raise often enough for thin value or as a bluff. Now, we just talked about the mistakes themselves, but these are kind of your archetypal villains. Like this, let's see, compliant station. We talked a little bit about this, but the overly aggressive player, if he bluffs too often and he bets too big and he overmerges his range, and that's important, then what kind of exploits do you want to make? Like, what do you want to do to exploit this player? Overly aggro. I mean, we just talked about it, but just really think about this, because I think most people's reaction to overt aggression is to push back on it. But let's not do that. If our opponent is very aggressive, and we have like a middle strength hand, how do we make money with our middle strength hand against an aggressive opponent? Like if we have a top pair weak kicker, and he makes his like fifth c-bet in a row, and we call, and he makes his fifth double barrel in a row. What do? Do we want to just say, well, he can't always have it, so I've got the best hand and I'm going to raise? Probably not. Probably not. Like we want to play judo or jiu-jitsu. We want to use his strength or weakness, whatever you want to call it. Use his pressure that he's applying against him. Don't push against somebody who's doing the pulling, right? Like when he's pushing against you, don't fight fire with fire. Fight fire with water. Allow him to continue to make his mistakes. That's how you beat him. The key to beating the aggressive player is to allow him to continue to aggress. If you have a middle strength hand, like a top pair with a weak kicker, by the time you've called turn, if he bet flop and bet turn and you called flop and you called turn, by the time you get to the river, your top pair with a weak kicker isn't looking that hot. But against a loose aggressive player, maniacally aggressive a player especially, the idea is if we have exactly called on the flop and exactly called on the turn, then we have the opportunity to get this top pair to showdown, maybe calling 2 or 3 times. If he bets again, we call again. If he checks, then, well, whatever, we'll deal with that when that happens. But let's just say we face the half pot triple barrel. By not raising and just calling this guy down, not only do we allow him to continue bluffing with hands he might have folded if we raised, but we also allow him to value own himself with his weird merges, which you'll see overly aggressive players do this very often. Sometimes it's because they think they can value bet thinner because of all the bluffs in their range, which probably is true, but they take it too far, and they'll do like a triple barrel, like half pot flop, half pot turn, half pot river with like second pair. So you don't want to fold those hands out when you've got top pair. You don't want to fold his bluffs out when you've got top pair. And if he actually has a big hand, you don't want to run into it. You don't want to create a cooler. That's how people lose to these super aggro players, is they end up playing big pots with mediocre hands against them when they just don't have to do that. In doing so, they fold out all the bluffs, they fold some of the value merges out, and they just end up kind of, I mean, it looks like intentional, but I mean, I know it's not, but you'll end up manufacturing a cooler by getting rid of all of the hands you could beat and kind of condensing your opponent's range to just the hands that do best against you. And that sounds like a pretty bad idea. So if our opponent folds too much, and he doesn't bluff or bluff catch often enough, then how do we beat this guy? If he folds too often, then what do? Well, we obviously bluff him, but then what happens when he bets us? Don't call. What if we bet and he raises? Fold. Um, and don't bet for thin value against these guys. If our opponent is compliant and calls too often, then we're in a very similar situation where we're doing a lot of bet folding. Like, we're going to bet and fold to a raise, the same as we were doing against the nit who folds too much. But against the compliant station, since he's got so many hands in his calling range, and he doesn't want to bluff very often, when he raises, he's usually raising with a very strong hand. So against a compliant calling station type player, we still want to be taking these bets and then fold to a raise lines, but we don't want to do it with like a polarized range where we're like bluffing some number of hands and then just value betting the very strongest hands. We want to actually be value betting, just betting like a linear value heavy, maybe value only range against these guys, and then folding the bulk of that range when they raise us, because we're going to be betting for thin value, and we're not going to be getting raised very often. And if we were, then we wouldn't be able to bet so thin. But since we're not going to be getting raised very often, we can bet for thinner value. We don't have to bluff as often because they're not folding as often. And then when they raise us, we can be pretty confident that we're going to be making the correct fold, unless we've got something towards the very top of our range. So those are the three main mistake types, and then the main three types of villains. So now let's talk, and really this is the way I wanted to set this video up, is first we talk about the mistakes, then we talk about the types of players that make them, and we just keep adding layer of complexity upon layer of complexity. And I think I will do that if I decide to follow up with this series, which really just comes down to you guys. If you put a bunch of comments on it, if you enjoyed it, if I get a lot of thumbs up, a lot of views. I mean, if you like this, share this, because the more views I get, the more likely I am to turn this into a series. So, and the more feedback I get, if you want to see the next one, tell me that. Just put it in the comments. I read them all. So here's some very specific villains. We've got three I wanted to talk about. One player, a student of mine, was just telling me about. Now this guy, this student is he's a good, strong poker player. He understands game theory pretty well. He understands the strategy of Hold'em pretty well. But he's very new to heads-up poker. He's not played much of it. I turned him on to Will Tipton's book, which I really do think is one of the best poker books, if not the best poker book on the market. It's the best I've ever read, and I've read like most of them. I put it above Applications for sure. I put it above The Mathematics of Poker, just if for no other reason than it's more accessible. But I digress. Anyway, this guy that has just started playing heads-up poker and fallen in love with it. He's playing against an opponent who just fights for every pot. And he's saying like, Donovan, sorry guys, Navonod. He's saying like, Navonod, we've talked about how to beat calling stations, we've talked about how to beat maniacs, we've talked about how to beat nits, but how do we beat this kind of guy? And this is really what kind of led me to thinking about making this new video or videos. If this guy is fighting for every pot, it's like, in what way was he fighting for every pot? And this was the read that our hero had on villain. Our hero had the read on villain that he was not willing to fold anything if he had a piece of it or a draw or like ace highs. He was calling with all of his bottom pairs and his second pairs. He just did not want to fold if he had any piece at all. And he was using his air and draws to bluff with. He was peeling with his pocket pairs and bottom pairs and ace highs, and he was turning his overcard floats or peels into bluffs when Fede would... I'm sorry, I didn't mean to use the cat's name. Shout out to Fede. But when Fede was c-betting, if the guy called, and then Fede checked the turn. The guy was getting aggressive, so the guy was just being very sticky when he had any piece at all, and being very aggressive when he had either a strong hand or no showdown value. And Fede is like, how do we beat this guy? And it's like, well, first of all, you probably want to stop playing this guy, because this is something very similar to how you want to play heads-up poker. You do want to fight for pots, and you should be taking your best, strongest hands out for value raises, and you should be bluff raising to balance that. And there's only two of you playing, and somebody has to win each pot, so there has to be a winner. There's only two of you. Man, if one player is going after every pot, or almost every pot, and constructing his ranges in such a way that he's, and this is kind of this is what I do. If I sit down, if I sit somebody in the first orbit, the first blind round, then I'm going to be like betting and double barreling and triple barreling a wide ass range. Like basically I'm going to take my hands that have good showdown value, like my ace highs with backdoor flush draws, my ace highs with backdoor straight draws, my ace highs with backdoor straight flush draws, my double overcards with the same, backdoor draws. I'm going to be taking basically the hands that don't have showdown value. I'm sorry, the ace highs that have showdown value and some equity. I'm going to be checking those back and peeling with them and calling with them. I'm going to take my hands that have some kind of equity but less showdown value, and I'm going to turn those into big like check raise bluffs and double barrels and triple barrels. Like if I have king queen of hearts and the flop is jack of hearts, 8 of diamonds, 5 of clubs, I'm very liable to just check raise that and just jam it down your throat. I'm gonna probably need either a turn card that improves my equity or as a scare card to your range. But very often I'm going to be, say check raising, betting the turn, and then barreling the river with a polarized range. Like I'm going to have nothing, or I'm going to have like nut value hands. I'm going to be c-betting air a lot. I'm like stabbing at every pot. Because I'm trying to win every pot, because I'm either stabbing my air on the flop, or I have a showdown value hand that I'm checking back and trying to win by getting that hand to showdown, or I have a value hand that I'm trying to win not just the pot, but I'm trying to win a bigger pot by getting more bets in by playing that aggressively. So this guy here, this isn't a terrible poker player, but based on this, how do we play against this guy? If he fights for every pot, literally every pot, he's a very active 3-better. He's peppering you with continuation bets, double barrels, triple barrels. He floats your c-bets. He check raises wide and polar out of position. And he's just calling you down. He's calling, hates to fold. Well, if this guy hates to fold, the first thing we do is get rid of our bluffs. Okay? If he likes to rebluff us and he hates to fold, we don't want to have a weak range. So I would say we would tighten up our aggression, maybe increase our raise sizes, and we just make hands and extract value. And if we make a hand, the best way to extract value is going to be something like this against exactly this guy. If he's overly aggressive with his air, then I want to be bluff catching, right? So I want to take the hands that I have that are like not strong enough to value bet, not strong enough to value raise, but I want to check those and call with them. Now, I mean that these are hands that do have showdown value. So like I'm gonna just check fold and give up with my misses. I'm not gonna like be running a bunch of bluffs with no showdown value, but I'm gonna have draws, showdown value, and traps in my checking ranges, so that I can check and call, and then I can get some check raises in, depending on runouts on, and which part of my range I have on flops, turns, and or rivers. The main thing is, against this type of opponent, we can
we can value bet them with our normal value hands, but when our opponent is super aggressive, we might do better with our lighter value hands by turning them into bluff catches, by checking and inducing him. Then, like our normal 3 street value hands, like top pairs, we can bet those and bet those, and then like check and call those. But like our traps and our draws and our showdown value hands, I think we should be doing a lot of checking um, and calling. And then when we actually say, if we're out of position and we check call, get to the river and we've made our draw, or we have been trapping with a set, then we can go check raise on the river. But the very, the number one piece of information you need against this guy is that you're going to have to win against this guy at showdown. So get rid of the hands that can't win at showdown before you pile money into the pot. Because he's going to be putting pressure on your showdown hands. He's going to be putting pressure on your, like he could be rebluffing you. He's not going to fold to your bluffs. So just get rid of those. It's like playing the ace, king, queen game, except don't play the queens. You bet your aces, check and call your kings, and don't do anything with your queens. Just get rid of them. And that's one way to go against a player like this. If the guy is very, very aggressive and he does not want to fold, if he's exactly loose and gives a lot of action, but he's also very aggressive and is somebody that you have to decide whether you want to give action or not, then really the thing you can do is play your hands face up. Just play as if you have face-up ranges. Now, depending on his exact composition, like his exact poker playerdom, like how often he triple barrels and with what kinds of ranges, sometimes you can do even better than just getting rid of your bluffs and playing face-up. You know that maybe he likes to double barrel and then give up on rivers, so maybe you want to go like check call and then check raise turns with your sets or really big hands. But if you just know he's going to call you down a lot, and he's also going to be like over bluffing, then you can just take all your value hands and just bet them, and then just take all of your showdown value hands and bluff catchers and check and call with them, and then just take the bottom of your range and just fold it out. Just give up with it. So that's enough about that guy. The more information we have about this guy, the more accurate our reads and exploits become. And in fact, we could probably do an entire video on nothing but just how to beat this guy and keep adding layers and layers of depth to him. Okay, so player number 2 is a tag. He just won't give you any action. He's not calling you, he's not raising you, he's just doing so much folding, and you're just sitting here, it's just taking you forever, and you're not getting anywhere with this guy. Then anytime you actually do go post flop with him, the prick ends up like raising you off your hand, or calling you down and having you beat with some like top pair, top kicker, 2 pair type hand. He just like always has a strong range when you go post flop with him, and he doesn't do a lot of calling pre-flop and folding on the flop, so you're not making any money by building pots pre-flop and winning them with c-bets. How do you beat this guy? How do you beat player 2 here? Well, first of all, what's he doing wrong? The first thing he's doing wrong is he's not calling or raising often enough pre-flop. So he's too tight pre-flop. How do you beat that? Well, you bluff more often. Now, in heads up, that just means you can, like, make your raise sizes smaller if you want to. You could do like a min raise, and min raise every single hand, just 100% min raise game. And if he's a tight player, and if he does call you, understand that he's going to have a stronger range. And so be a little bit more selective about the hands that you semi-bluff with, but I think you can probably still stab flops with semi-bluffs and see what he's actually doing with his range. Because, even if he's got a really tight range, like if he's folding, I don't know, 60% versus a min raise, you're going to be printing money there. Like, you don't have to do much beyond that to win the game. But if you can kind of think about what that range looks like, and you know that he's a taggy type player who isn't going to like float and peel and maybe like bluff raise flops, this is sort of like a double-edged sword, because on one end he gets post flop with a stronger range that is going to hit more strong hands on more flops, but um, he also isn't going to float or peel. So I think that we want to, against this type of player, my first reaction, my first instinct is move to min raising 100% of all starting hands from the button, and pepper him with 3 bets. And we have to see how he reacts to the 3 bets before we know if that's a good idea or not. Because it could be that he's just tight and risk averse, so if you 3-bet him, he's going to be very foldy. But it could actually also be that since he is so tight, and if he's open folding a lot, then his range is just so strong when he open raises that he feels like he doesn't want to fold the 3 bets. But I would test it. I would test it out with a very polarized 3-betting range. I would open raise any 2 cards against him from the button. And then when the flop comes out, we should be able to do a pretty decent job of knowing whether it hits his range or not. And I'm going to test him out with some C-bets, because he's probably not going to screw around too much. We can probably make some pretty good C-bets, and I would say either if the flop just doesn't hit his range, if it doesn't look like something that's going to be very good for the types of hands we expect him to call with, which is going to be a more narrow range than most players, then we can C-bet pretty liberally with our bluffs. But if it is a board that kind of looks like it interacts pretty well with his range, like he might have a decent amount of reasonable something type hands on the flop, then we can move to like a one and done strategy with a specific set of hands, with the option to play turns profitably. Okay, so what I mean is, like, if the range that he has, or we expect him to have, interacts with the flop in a piss poor way, we can c-bet like everything. Just pepper him with c-bets and see how he reacts. Because he's probably not going to be floating, he's not going to be peeling, he's not going to be raising a slight. But he is going to get post flop with a lot of stronger hands. But we should be able to look and see what boards look like they're going to interact with him. Like Broadway cards are going to be good for him, right? Just for instance. Now, the other thing I was trying to say is, if the board does look like he's going to have some hands on it, like maybe it's, I don't know, like Queen 9-2 two-tone, then he's going to have some of that. Or like Ace 10-5 two-tone, he's going to have some of that. So I would be willing to c-bet those spots still, just to kind of test it out. But I would do so only with hands that will be able to turn equity, so I can play some turns profitably. I don't need to be able to play all turns profitably, but I want to have like backdoor straight draw, backdoor flush draw, gut shot, overcard type hands. And then maybe I'm not going to go for the double barrel bluff all the time when I turn equity, but maybe I go for the check call if I've got, well, it depends. It depends on the exact run out. If the turn card improves my equity, is good for my range, and is bad for a villain's range, then yeah, probably just going for the double barrel there. So probably enough about the tag. Mainly, we don't want to give this guy loose action. We want to take it to him aggressively. We want to test out how he reacts to 3-bets, and that can go one of 2 ways usually. And it might even go a third way. He might just like be really good against 3-bets and actually open a light 4-betting range, in which case we just want to like abort. But we want to have a polarized 3-betting range against the tight aggressive player to test him out. We want to widen our range, probably reduce our raise size. We just don't need to risk that much against the tag. And when we go post flop with the lead, we want to test him out with c-bets, but don't plan on doing a lot of double barreling. Like, you only want to take the most pristine double barrels, because like he's gonna have, if he's got a tight range pre-flop, then post flop he's gonna hit the flops in bigger ways in general. Like, he's gonna flop more top pairs with a good kicker type hands than like bottom pairs, or like he's gonna have more second pair top kicker type hands than second pair with a weak kicker. because he's folding all those hands that make those types of hands on the flop. He's folding them pre-flop, and then also don't pay him off. Like, don't call his 3 bets. Don't call his 4 bets. Don't call him super light when he opens. Tend to be a little bit more likely to 3-bet or fold. I mean, you should still have a calling range, of course, but make it some stronger hands that call, and then 3-bet the weaker hands that want to continue and the strongest hands that want to continue. So I would say polarize your aggression against this guy. Don't give him a lot of action. Test him out with C-bets, and when you turn equity, maybe test him out with some double barrels to see if you can find some imbalances. That's my approach to player 2. Player 3 limps all of his buttons. He will do some limp raising, some limp calling, but he doesn't ever limp fold. He likes to give you the lead, and he is not afraid to trap and get sticky. How do we play against this guy? So the first thing I would think if I ran into a player who played like this, who was like doing a lot of limping, and then when I raised, he was sometimes limp raising me, and sometimes he was limp calling me, but he was rarely limp folding. The first thing I would ask is, I wonder if I'm being too aggressive or if my image is overly aggressive against this guy. Either way, he's being very compliant with a lot of his range. He's limping everything, so he's not aggressing. He's not folding. He's exactly complying. He's doing the check collie, limpy collie type stuff most of the time. And so the way we want to beat up on these guys is to not have a lot of bluffs in our range. We want to value own these clowns. So I think that when they limp, we can value raise thin, but we don't want to bluff raise. And then if we face the limp raise, we probably just have to give them credit and let our hand go. But if we have some kind of a middle strength or kind of not that great hand, a weaker type hand, and they limp, then we're just going to check. We're just going to take a look at the flop and try to value on them. If we hit it in a big way, we're going to bet, bet, bet. If we hit it in a middle type way, we're going to check, call, check, and play poker on turns and rivers. And if we pick up air, we're probably just going to check and fold and be done with it. But if we pick up some like ace, king, well, if we pick up some like backdoor straight flush draws with ace highs, and maybe we can go for the check and call and do like a floating type strategy against him, just to kind of see how things are going to pan out against his limping range. But if we have like more of the middle strength type second pair hands, we're going to want to just like check and call. If we have like the nut value hands, we probably want to check and raise. If we just have the strong value hands, we want to just bet, bet, bet. And very basically, we want to attack the fact that he is compliant by under bluffing and raising thinner than we normally would for value, and being able to make good hero folds against his raises. Then post flop, we want to value own him, and we can take like all of our strong value hands and just go for 3 streets. If this guy, since we know he will occasionally do the limp raise, if we find out that some of those limp raises are bluffs, then we can have some traps in our ranges, like maybe he limps and we raise, and we've got like ace king suited, pocket aces, pocket tens up, and then he comes over the top. Maybe we can just call, and that's going to depend a lot on how he plays post flop. But if he likes to give us the lead, then that means, well, and if he's getting sticky and he's not afraid to make some hero calls or traps, we don't want to be, what we don't want to be doing is we don't want to be falling into these traps and over bluffing against a guy that's not going to call. So we want our ranges to be stronger on average when we get called, and especially when we face a raise. And especially when we're playing in big pots. So just from the rip, the first thing we want to do is tighten up in terms of bluffs, widen our value range, go linear, That way, when we do face the limp raise, we're going to have a higher percent of good hands, just because we won't have the weak hands in our range that can continue. And then when we go post flop, since he likes to let us have the lead and he's just going to like check and call, we don't want to be doing a lot of bluffing. We want to, like, if he lets us raise pre-flop and he calls, but he's in position, and the flop comes out. If we've got a strong hand, we want to bat, and then bat, and then bat. And if we've got like a really strong hand, we might want to just test out and see if we bet flop, bet turn, or bet flop and check turn, if he might even float us and then try to take us off of whatever, then we might want to have some traps in our range. But that's the kind of thing that you really need to find out in game by looking at showdowns and checking out frequencies. But basically the deal with this guy is we want to just have strong hands when a lot of money goes in. And the way that we want to put the money in is we want to put the money in aggressively, because he's more likely to make calling mistakes than raising or folding mistakes. Yeah, I think that's further than I really wanted to go with that part of the video. We probably want to take a look at Navonod's line. If you haven't seen this, this is just a way to frame your hands out by relative hand value and adjusting to your opponent's mistake propensities. That OMP is opponent mistake propensity. RHV is relative hand value. So here's the line, and you can use this against everybody. The line works like this. It's got this hot to cold to hot, where it's hot and red on the poles. So on the poles, this is where you find your incentive to get aggressive. And then in the center, you don't have incentive to get aggressive. So this is like nutted value, value, showdown value, bluff catcher, draw, and air. So we have the maximum amount of incentive to become aggressive when we don't have any showdown value. We'd really love to get the folds when we don't have any showdown value. And we'd really love to build a big pot with our bets and raises when we have nut value. A little less so, but still we have some incentive to build pots with value hands. A little less so, but we still have incentive to get some folds when we have draws. And then when we're right in the middle here with showdown value bluff catcher, we just don't have any incentive to get aggressive, because we're just wasting our hands. If we have second pair and we bet flop, bet turn, bet river, we fold out everything that we beat and we condense our opponent's range into just a bunch of hands that beat us. We take away the opponent's bluffs that could have put money in bad against us if we had only checked and called. So there's just nothing good to do aggressively here. So the line represents a spectrum where the red poles are your incentive to aggress, and your center is the place of least aggression. Remember that tight villains will shift your relative hand value to the right. Stations shift it to the left, and maniacal opponents, like loose aggressive players, pull you in towards the center. So if you have a hand that you would normally think of as something like a nutted value hand against a maniac, that pulls you in towards the center, and you should maybe play it more like a value hand, like bet flop, or well, check flop even if you're out of position. Maybe, well, I mean, either way, you could like either take a bet check approach or a check and see what happens, and if he checks back, bet approach. But if you have a like normally thin value hand against a maniac, that's gonna pull it into the center and turn it into more like a showdown value type hand, just in terms of the line you're taking, by the way. Because you don't want to bet a thin value hand and get raised, and so you have less incentive, you can less profitably bet a thin value hand against a maniac, because sometimes he raises and you're going to be in a bind. And you don't want to bet and be forced to fold the best hand. I mean, you can't get away with that very often. You don't want to do it too much. You want to avoid it whenever possible, right? And sometimes the best way to do that is just to take this thin value hand and turn it into like a showdown value hand or a bluff catcher in your mind. So just check it back, because number one, you don't have as much incentive to bet it. Number two, you have more incentive to check it back because your opponent will be bluffing. So you can maybe take that top pair bottom kicker that you'd normally bet for value on the flop and just check it back and call down. Maybe that nut value hand when you 3-bet aces out of position, got called, and the flop came out ace, 9, 5, rainbow. Maybe with a nut value hand, you want to play it, more like a value or showdown value hand where you're going to check and let him bet and call, and check and let him bet and call. Now the same thing works here when we have air against a maniac or a draw against a maniac. Again, it shifts us more to the center of the spectrum, which means that we're not going to be doing as much betting and raising with these type hands against those maniacs. We don't want to just get blown off of hands. We don't want to miss an opportunity to hit a card and allow him to rep. Like if we have a draw, for instance, and let's say it's a flush draw, and if we normally would bet it, but we're in position and we raised, villain calls, he's a maniac, but he calls pre-flop. We flop like the second nut flush draw. If we check back, then if the draw comes in, uh, aggressive opponents are going to look to put a bunch of pressure on us. So that's a nice thing about it, is they'll often rep our improvement cards. Same thing if we call pre-flop and we flop the draw, instead of doing like check raising, if we check and call and we actually get there on the turn and we check again, very often this maniacal opponent is going to continue barreling our improvement cards. So that gives us more incentive to check our draws. The other thing is if we start betting our draws, we risk getting blown off of our draws. Like maybe we go for the check raise and villain jams it in our, like rips it in our face, and we don't have the odds to call. Whereas if we had just checked and called, maybe we end up stacking in that hand. And I think it should be pretty obvious and clear why tighter players shift our relative hand value towards the right of center or to the right of the line. It's like if our opponent is, what was I talking about? Tight shifts right, yeah. Very tight, then we can't bet as thinly for value because we end up just wasting our hands. So a tight player kind of turns our value hands into showdown value hands. And maybe we should be playing our showdown value hands more like draws, which means like with more incentive to aggress, because our showdown value bluff catcher hands end up not doing as well as bluff catchers against players that don't bluff, right? So maybe we don't mind just folding our opponent's equity out if we're just going to free roll him and we don't have much to gain by letting him, and trying to induce a bluff against a player who's never going to bluff is just an awful lot like letting him realize whatever equity he has for free with no upside. So maybe we should become more aggressive against that kind of opponent. And of course, if we have a draw or air, we have just infinite incentive to aggress against very tight players. Stations shift you to the left. If you have what would normally just be a solid value hand, you can play it like the nuts. Just bet, 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 or check, raise, bet, bomb. If you have what would normally be a showdown value hand, it might end up being more like a thin value hand. If you have a draw, you don't have any fold equity, so you're going to shift that to the left and play it more like a bluff catcher in that you're going to check and call until you actually hit your hand, but then you're not going to have a draw anymore. Once you hit your hand, you have a value hand, and we know that we're going to be aggressing with those value hands. If we have air, we have a less incentive to aggress against a station because number one, we don't need to incentivize him to call. He's going to call us anyway. Number two, our bluffs will not make good money against or even break even against these players most of the time. So that's how you use the line. In conclusion, guys, have good default lines and ranges and have a good overall strategy that you can retreat back into and launch your attacks and counterattacks from. Be ever on the lookout for leaks and imbalances, things to exploit. Know or learn how to identify them and what to do to exploit them. Know how to exploit each type of leak, imbalance, and beware of your own image. Make sure that if your image looks a certain way that you're watching out for the types of things that could be coming to exploit or counter exploit your adjustments. Keep your guard up. Be very ready to counter the counter to the counter to the counter to the adjustment that you did to adjust his adjustment. Rinse, repeat process. Till next time, guys. Navonod on No Limit Hold'em. Good quote. LUCK and